Hello, today we're going to be talking about incorporating research into your essay, specifically the urban legend essay, but it's going to be applicable to our other essays as well. Now, when we talk about incorporating research, what does it mean? Well, first of all, think about the word incorporate. See if it reminds you of any other words. If we look to Merriam-Webster for the definition of incorporating, they say it means to blend or combine thoroughly. Okay? The word incorporate is related to the word corp or corpse, right? Related to body, because it means actually taking it into your body. In our essay, that means blending or combining things from other sources, other authors, into our writing so that it's all one piece. Okay, it's all combined so that even though you're quoting from another source, that's still part of your essay now. Right? But of course, we still have to make sure that we're using it in appropriate ways. Okay. When we use evidence from research, we have to synthesize with our own ideas. Okay, it's not just a patchwork quilt. We don't just quote, paraphrase, and move on. We have to still bring our own ideas to bear. If we were to look at they say, I say, one of the things they talk about when it comes to incorporating sources are the three ways to respond. Okay? The most typical way we think of is agreeing. You quote from a source or paraphrase from a source because it is in agreement with your thesis. And that's a perfectly valid way to use research. But sometimes we bring up a source just to disagree with it as a counterpoint, which is something we'll talk about more in our next unit, but I did want you to be aware of it. Of course, there can be a combination, right? Maybe something in the source you happen to agree with, something that you disagree with, and that's fine. They say, I say gives a lot of information of that. In terms of our urban legend essay, keep in mind that you may be quoting from the urban legend or a false conception of the source, and then you have to say that it's wrong. That doesn't mean you have to say, I disagree. But rather you can quote from the source and follow it up by saying, this is wrong because, then fill in the rest. So just something to keep in mind when we're responding to sources, it's not just dropping in what the source says and moving on. We're really engaging with it in a meaningful way. Okay? Now, to add to that, every time you use research in your paper, okay, so every time you have a quotation or a paraphrase, I want you to think about three steps: introduce, cite, and explain. And to best understand this, I want to include a piece of evidence from the sample urban legend essay that I provided for you on D2L, because this student really did a great job with this. Okay? The first part is introducing. Okay? If you're going to use a piece of evidence, you have to give your reader some context for what it is, okay, where it's coming from, because it's not just your own ideas. So for here, Eric Lipton and Gardner Harris, writers from the New York Post, discuss the recent mindsets of most public industries. Okay? That's context. That's introducing what this source is, where it's from, and it's really great to do that with an author, and even more ideally with an indication of where the source came from. It's not required every single time, but it's a great idea. Okay? Now, citing is when you actually use the information and then give a citation, the MLA citation, which we'll talk about in other places. Okay, but the cite is where you're actually paraphrasing or quoting. Okay, so it goes into what information these authors said. If they mention is that as time goes on, more and more industries are pushing for more regulations from federal and state authorities. Now notice this is not the proper way to cite, but that's okay. Like I said, this paper is not perfect. But that's a good paraphrase, right? In the student's own words, what the source had to say, but also giving us some specific information. And then the last step, this is where a lot of people stop, and that's a shame because this is the most important piece. This is where you make sense of the research. You explain it and how it relates to your topic. Okay, and if we start here, this article really shows why the urban legend is false, because it is clear that businesses want effective regulations so that they can make more money. These public food businesses know that they have large consequences if they do not meet the federal and state regulations, etc. So here, the author is actually explaining what the importance of that information from the source is, and even more importantly, how it relates to his thesis, how it's backing up what he has to say. That's what you need to do. That's why we incorporate research, not just to put it in there and do what they say, I say calls a hit and run, where you hit it and then you just leave it alone. No, you actually have to explain. You have to engage with it. Okay, that's really what we're looking for in our writing. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, when you use research, whether it's a paraphrase or quotation, you always must synthesize with your own thoughts, right? That's the I say. You present what they say, the source, and then you follow it up with what I say. You always have to tie it back to the focus of the essay, your thesis. Okay, every single paragraph of your essay, every single discussion has to at some point be tied back to an analysis of the urban legend. Don't get off kilter. Okay? A lot of students start writing about their urban legend, maybe about home invasion. Then they start talking about the real world situations, which is good, but then it just turns into an argument paper about why home invasion is a bad thing. That's not what we're looking for. Okay? It's all about that analysis of the urban legend. Okay? So make sure that you're keeping that in mind. Okay? So that's the first thing you need to keep in mind with incorporating our research. But the next piece of the puzzle we have to consider is how to put that information in our paper, how to actually cite something. Okay? And when we look at any given piece of evidence that we want to include, we read an article or a book and we find a really nice sentence or a couple of sentences with good statistics or data, we have a choice between quotation and paraphrasing. Okay? Now with quotation, that's the exact words. That offers more credibility, right? It's the exact words of the source, and it's also more specific. Those are the benefits there. But paraphrasing still allows you to give the amount of data it's just in your own language. This is when the ideas are all that matter from the source, and using in your own language is appropriate. Okay? And another way to think about this with quotation and paraphrasing is that when you're quoting, you got to make sure you choose appropriate language to quote that's sufficiently coherent. In other words, if you take that quotation out of its original context, the article or the book, and you put it in the middle of your own paper, you have to blend it. It has to make sense by itself because your reader does not have the rest of it there in front of them. Whereas paraphrasing, it is truly in your own style, your own sentence structure. And if you look in the samples in the reading, you'll see that when you paraphrase, it's not even just in your own words, it's your own sentence structure. Okay, it has to sound like something you wrote. Okay, now a good guideline, and this is not a hard and fast rule, it's really a rule of thumb, okay, is that about 10 to 15% of an essay should be quoted material. Okay, and every paragraph, every body paragraph should have some evidence either way, either quotation or paraphrase. You can certainly have more than a single quotation or paraphrase, but if you don't have any evidence in a paragraph, you're not really giving yourself something, hard and concrete to build off of. Okay, so that should be your minimum goal, piece of evidence in every paragraph. Like I said, about 10 to 15% of the essay should be quoted. That's not too much to the point where you're not writing enough of your own essay, but it's also enough to lend that credibility to what you're writing about for your reader. Okay? Now the last thing I want to talk about in this section and in this video has to do with how to write good quotations and paraphrases. Okay? Now once again, coming from the sample urban legend essay I gave you, I have a good quotation. Ann Meyer, a writer for the Chicago Tribune, there's that introduction, states, quote, "With organic products on the rise, Smolyensky, president and chief executive of Morton Grove-based Lifeway Foods, is targeting company sales of $24 million this year. That's double the level of 2002 when she took the helm of the publicly traded company upon the death of her father. This piece of text displays clear evidence of an increase of people in our society who are purchasing organic foods. The increase in organic food consumption reflects the anxiety that Americans have with food safety because they are choosing the safest possible foods. It appears it's seen even to a greater extent because organic foods usually cost more than non-organic foods." So here, once again, tying it into that discussion of the urban legend, have a nice quoted passage here. And it makes sense to quote here because it's got some specific data, right? That you could paraphrase this, you could put it in your own words, but since those specific numbers are so important, this is a great time to quote. Now, let's say this author wanted to paraphrase, though, that would be okay, but you have to do it appropriately. Okay? For instance, Ann Meyer, a writer for the Chicago Tribune, states, "With organic things rising, Smolyensky, president and chief executive of Lifeway Foods, is trying to get sales of $24 million this year. That's 2 times the level of 2002 when she took over the publicly traded company upon her father's death." Okay? So first of all, this is a sloppy paraphrase because we still have one of the quotation marks. We're using very similar language, right? There's a few words that are changed, right? Organic products to organic things, on the rise, rising, president and chief executive, president, chief executive. But even with those little changes, it's not really putting it in your own words, in your own phrasing. This still sounds like this author took the article from the Chicago Tribune, changed a word here or there, and then presented it as their own. That is a big problem. Okay? A good paraphrase that is not guilty of plagiarism, though, which is much better, is this. Okay? And I'll leave the other one up there as a sample just to compare. Ann Meyer, writer for the Chicago Tribune, states, so the introduction is the same because that's the author's input, that organic products are becoming more and more popular. As such, Lifeway Foods is on the verge of making $24 million this year, twice as much as they made about a decade ago. So I'm still presenting the same amount of important data. I've got the $24 million this year, that is twice as much as before, but what's missing is that exact phrasing from the original source, right? Quite a bit is different. The sentence structure is much more in my style as opposed to this writer from the Chicago Tribune. So that's what we're looking for a good paraphrase, okay? So there are other samples in the Quick Access Compact textbook that you'll want to look for in your reading. And when you do your practice activity, you want to pay attention to these things. But just remember, when you quote, be exact, use their exact words and make sure it blends with the rest of the sentence. When you paraphrase, make sure it's in your own wording, your own style, because a bad paraphrase really sticks out like a sore thumb because it breaks up the flow of your writing. And regardless of which method you're using, you want to introduce, cite, and explain.